Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone throughout the world that is joining us today for our Executive Ethics Symposium. My name is Paul Melendez, and I serve as the Assistant Department Head in our Department of Management and Organizations, a professor of practice, and also the very proud founder of our Center for Leadership Ethics. Our center is well known internationally for our research, education, and outreach programs. This particular program today is one of our thought leadership programs. When I developed this program many years ago, the idea was to try to bring topics of interest and importance to leaders in the government, business, and nonprofit sectors. In past years, we've explored the merits of benefit corporations, the practicality of socially responsible investing, and most recently, the ethical implications associated with artificial intelligence. And I believe that today with our Executive Ethics Symposium, our topic is just as timely and relevant as in years past. Today, we're going to be looking at the ethical aspects of data collection, protection, and usage. And we have assembled just a world-class panel of experts from academia, industry, and the nonprofit sector. Before I hand over the moderating duties to my dear colleague, Michael Fricke, I do want to recognize a few people that have been instrumental in supporting and getting today's program up and going, and of course, sponsoring our program. So for Mariah Brown, who you see Mariah, who is very, very humble, I want to just say thank you, Mariah, for all the hours you've devoted behind the scenes to setting up today's program. So thank you, Mariah. And I also want to recognize Doug Zanes and Claudia Zanes. Doug is currently on our board for the Center for Leadership Ethics, and he and his wife, what I like to refer to as the power couple, are very proud sponsors of today's webinar. So I'd like to give Doug and Claudia a few moments to welcome everyone and to offer a few words. So Doug, I believe you're on mute right now. I'm going to turn over the microphone to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Hope everybody can hear me. Just want to take a few minutes and talk to everybody about why both Claudia and I are such big supporters of the Center for Leadership Ethics at Eller. You know, over the years, we've really come to believe that the center does a phenomenal job with something that's actually very, very important. You know, if you look around the world today and you look at ethics in general, you know, there tends to be, you know, everybody has different perspectives on how things should be, which is pretty fantastic. But what the center really focuses on is taking both high school students and college students and really teaching them to think through ethical issues and put thought into their decision making as opposed to simply making a decision and driving forward. And that covers everything from, you know, corporate government or corporate governance and social responsibility to, quite frankly, things that you see are, you know, criminal behavior that you see, you know, in the business world. You know, and it involves having conversations about honesty and integrity in your decision making, loyalty when it comes to making business decisions, fairness on all sides, respect for everybody who's going to be impacted by those decisions, you know, concern for others, as well as law, you know, making legal decisions that aren't illegal. You know, and that runs a gamut. And quite frankly, without this program, and I think there are very few of these programs around the country, without this program, the students actually don't get engaged in that decision-making process as part of their educational endeavors. And so we've decided it's a phenomenal program that we love to support, we will continue to support, because each year we have these conversations and we cover topics like this. And you look around the world and you talk about the ethics involved in remote working. You talk about the ethics involved in peaceful protests versus things you see in the news and how to change the world. I mean, the topics are never ending. So thank you, Paul, for doing such a great job with the program. I'll hand it back, and I'll just tell you, Claudia and I will always support this program, and we hope everybody listening really engages in this program and supports it as well.
Thank you, Doug. Again, a big thank you to you and your lovely wife that for years have been very, very generous sponsors and also supporters of the Center for Leadership Ethics. I think that Doug has just planted a seed potentially for our 2021 Executive Ethics Symposium, and I can see my colleague Sudha smiling, this idea of evaluating kind of the ethical merits of remote work, right? Something that we are all experiencing firsthand, some more so in some sectors than others. But again, thank you, Doug and Claudia, for all that you've done for us. With that, I'd like to introduce everyone to my colleague and my very dear friend, Michael Fricke. Michael is our Associate Director for the Center for Leadership Ethics, and he's also a Senior Lecturer in our Department of Management and Organizations. Michael and I, since we acquired him from the University of Illinois, which was a very strategic acquisition, have done quite a bit of work together, and I really feel that our center has really kicked into another gear with Michael's addition, along with Alex Ellis, who heads up our research center. But today, I've asked Michael to take on the responsibility of serving as our moderator. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you the virtual baton, Michael, and let you take it from here. Michael?
All right, thank you, Paul. And I echo everything that Paul said. We're super grateful to Mariah and especially to Doug and Claudia for everything that you guys do. Really, really excited to hear from our just like all-star panelists today. I'm gonna toss up a poll real quick. If you wouldn't mind, answer this poll real quick. We're so interested to know where you all came from and are tuning in from. You know, one of the neat things about switching to a virtual format for this year's symposium is that we can have people from all over the world. So I'm gonna put this poll up real quick. If you wouldn't mind just telling us where you came from, and then while I continue doing some introductions here. So I'm going to run through the agenda with you very briefly, give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. So after I'm done here, our three panelists are each going to have 15 minutes to discuss some aspects of the ethics of data that are interesting to them. Then after those three 15-minute blocks, the panelists are going to interact with one another and respond to what they said in their 15 minutes. After that, we're going to have a chance to take some questions from you all who are attending. And in order to do that, what I'm going to ask you to do is use the Q&A feature in Zoom. So down at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. If you would click that, and as our panelists are speaking, any questions that might come up, please use the Q&A feature, and then I will curate those questions and distribute them during the Q&A session to our panelists. So I would really appreciate it if you would submit your questions. We want to hear from you. Our panelists are eager to hear what you think and what questions might come up. So without further ado, I'm going to stop our poll here and see where folks are joining us from. About 60% from Arizona, about 30% from other places in the U.S., 10 folks from outside of the U.S. in North America. I know we have some friends from Canada and Mexico on there. That's exciting. One person from South America, 3 from Asia. That's super exciting to us that, you know, we have people from around the world tuning into the symposium. So thank you guys all for being here. I'm going to give each of the panelists just 1 minute to do a quick introduction and give you a little tease about what they're going to be discussing. So we'll start with Gerry Zack, who's the CEO of the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and the Healthcare Compliance Association. Gerry, can you take 1 minute and do a brief intro?
Sure, thanks, and thanks for having me, and welcome everyone. I'm Gerry Zack, CEO of Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. We're about a 20,000 member association for compliance and ethics professionals. I've been with the society for about 3 years now, but prior to that, I spent the first 30 years of my career really as a forensic accountant and investigator, and had an opportunity to perform a lot of different types of data analytics in two capacities. One is as an investigator, and second as someone who was attempting to design preventive measures to prevent wrongdoing and to detect it in very, very early stages. So much of my focus in data analytics will be in that sort of arena, the whole idea of preventing and detecting any type of wrongdoing, whether that be fraud or corruption or just someone breaking the rules. So that's sort of the slant at it that I will be coming at it from.
Terrific. Thank you, Gerry. Following Gerry will be Fernando Levy from Vanguard, where he's the head of retail data and analytics solutions. Fernando, can you take a minute and introduce yourself?
There you go. Now you can hear me. Perfect. So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and joining Gerry and Sudha as panelists. I am originally from Argentina, so that could count as South America if you want to put it that way, but I've been in the US for over 20 years now. And in my background, I have worked in financial services corporations for many years, including Citigroup, MasterCard, American Express, and I spend now the last 8-10 months of my life with Vanguard, right, a financial services asset management group, in the role of data analytics for retail. Prior to that, I worked with an insurance company, AIG, for many years, for a few years over there, and I spent as well, I was a consultant in both the digital transformation space as well on the strategy consulting side with many companies in technology, consumer, financial services. So what I think about telling or share with you is some of my experience and challenges that I went through in the aspect of collection and protection and usage of data across all the different industries and in different roles that I've done on the data side as well from the technology and how we think about using and leveraging data in new technologies.
Terrific. Thank you, Fernando. And last but certainly not least is our distinguished Eller faculty representative, Sudha Ram, who is the Anheuser-Busch Endowed Chair of Management Information Systems, Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and the Director of Insight, the Center for Business Intelligence and Analytics. That's a mouthful. Sudha, can you give us a brief intro?
Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning to everyone. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with Gerry and Fernando. And Doug, thanks so much for your support. And Paul, what a wonderful center you're running. So I've been here at the University of Arizona in the Eller College. I also have a joint appointment with computer science, and I've been here since 1985, which is 35 years. And I've seen the advent of internet, and I've seen what it's done in terms of data availability. And so in my research center called Insight, we do a lot of work for leveraging big data in an ethical way. And so privacy and ethics are at the forefront of our mind, and we're very respectful of being able to repurpose data at the same time, leverage it for solving grand challenges or problems which have social implications. So today I will be talking about the tension between privacy and ethical use when you repurpose data, and at the same time, the ability to be able to leverage maximum value about it. And I'll talk about how it's possible to do both, although people think that's not possible in today's world.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Sudha. So just as a reminder, as questions arise, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to those towards the end. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Gerry Zack. Take it away, Gerry.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome once again for everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. As I said in my introduction, my background is heavily focused on investigating and then designing sort of proactive systems, if you will, to help companies primarily, organizations and companies, either prevent acts of wrongdoing, non-compliance, fraud, corruption, breaking rules, or at least detecting it in a very early manner. So That's kind of the slant I'll be coming at it with. My two fellow panelists, of course, have different types of experiences. So there's lots of uses of data that go well beyond what I'll be talking about. But I think me kicking it off kind of makes sense in that regard, because it's a real in-your-face kind of a use of data. And there's so much data that is currently available. When I first started doing investigations many years ago, what you got was a box of documents, and you'd pour through the documents and you'd interview people and you'd be done. And over the years, of course, the accumulation of data is massive. And the locations and sources of data are quite diverse and massive these days. It's not just data that's on computers, of course. It's on all sorts of mobile devices, and it's in the cloud, and it's with third parties. So many organizations have outsourced key functions so that large portions of their data is actually housed elsewhere. We've got wearable devices. There's all sorts of things. Data is accumulating with us all the time. If you look at the news reports, you will find, if you Google this, you'll find instances where companies have had chip implant parties where they've got chips implanted in their employees. So yes, it's that scary kind of use of data is out there. Typically in some boutique IT firms doing that, but nonetheless, it's out there, it's available. What we typically found when we would do investigations is that an act of wrongdoing likely could have been detected much, much sooner. And I'll give you a couple examples in a second to illustrate this. And it would always raise that question of why wasn't it detected sooner? And oftentimes answers would be, well, it's private. This is, we don't want to violate anyone's privacy. And indeed, of course, there are quite a few laws dealing with data protection and data privacy and employee rights and rights of that nature. What you typically find now is that almost all of those, whether you're talking about HIPAA in a healthcare setting or some of the state privacy laws or some of the broader things like GDPR and some others, is that there's almost always some sort of a carve-out and exception for using data to catch fraud or to catch corruption or to prevent it and things of that nature. So most of the applications of data that could prevent or detect acts of wrongdoing in very early stages are, quite frankly, what we find is that it would have been legal, wouldn't have violated any rights to perform that. So why don't organizations do it? It's a very simple question, but a very, very complex question, because you could you could prevent a lot more acts of wrongdoing. But as I said in an article that I wrote a couple of years ago, it can get kind of creepy, because you start looking at information that, while it might be legal to look at it, you're really getting into personal information, and there are a lot of ethical considerations, associated with this. So let me walk through, a couple of examples that will illustrate some of the key questions, that ethical questions that arise. And I'll start with a real simple, easy one. I can recall a number of years ago being called into a company, and the concern was that there was a ghost employee or ghost employees on the books. And what that means, the term ghost employee simply means there's someone getting a paycheck who doesn't really even exist. It's a fake, made-up employee. So, this company had 4,000 employees or so. In the olden days, what we would do is get a list of those 4,000 employees and go find them all, just to make sure that they actually existed. Well, in the days of data analytics, we can cut that work back tremendously. And in this example, there was a variety of different sources of data that we could use. The one that we chose that was the simplest to narrow down where the risk might be was that all employees that would work in the office would use a security swipe key card to get in and out of the office. Every employee was automatically issued one. Every employee in the payroll register had one of these issued. So there's data. It's not financial data. It's not your traditional data. It's data in the form of a security system maintaining a record of who entered and exited a building. So if there's a ghost employee, they wouldn't be coming into the office, would they? So it was a rather simple process. that whittled down these 4,000 employees to about 200 employees who never swiped a badge to get into the office. But now this raises another issue about data analytics, at least from the standpoint of detecting wrongdoing. You have to then consider, well, what are the potentially viable or legal reasons why you would have 200 employees not swiping a badge? Well, could there be some situations where people are authorized to work from home and they never come into the office? So there's the issue, and this points out one of the key issues associated with data analytics, that in some cases, data analytics by itself determines that wrongdoing has occurred. Okay, you go through a traffic signal and there's a traffic camera up there, or there's a the sensor detecting how fast you're going. It immediately detects, that's data, and it is immediately detecting an act of wrongdoing. In our case, it's the example I'm giving is the more common situation, which it doesn't automatically tell you, but it is a red flag that something is weird here, something is different from an ordinary transaction. I better look at these. So rather than looking at 4,000 employees, we had it immediately whittled down to 200. From the 200, we were able to very simply exclude those employees that were authorized to work from home. And in the end, it became very simple to target and identify here. You do, in fact, have ghost employees on your accounting records. Here's where they are. So that's a pretty simple and easy one to understand. Getting into other areas, though, like bribery and corruption, things like that, the data analytics oftentimes gets much more complicated. Oftentimes you've got multiple factors that you're looking at. And when we did investigations of large-scale Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations where the nature of the bribes were quite complex. So instead of looking for one thing like we did with our ghost employee, you're looking for 20 different possible things that could tell you that a bribe was taking place. So it can get very, very complicated, and once again, typically is getting into some data that is non-traditional types of data. I'll give one example. There was a bribery case where the suspicion was that customer service agents who had the ability to make adjustments to customers' account balances would basically negotiate bribes with those customers. And what the discovery is that these customer service agents typically always use the same sort of code language. No one ever says, for a bribe, I will do this. Okay, they don't talk like that. Crooks don't talk like that, right? What they would almost always say is, I can take care of that for you. What are you going to do to take care of me? So in scanning communications records, it was easy to narrow down who was using that type of language. Who's using that language in email messages and instant messages and things of that nature? You could see use of that expression, take care of. I can take care of your account balance. Are you going to take care of me? That's basically their offer to be open to a bribe, all right? So you start looking through all those, and all of a sudden, one of the emails that you go through says, I need to leave work early so that someone can take care of me after my chemo treatment. And all of a sudden you realize, should I be looking at that? The system, this great computer system that we're using to scan for these kinds of phrases just found a very personal, very intimate message that I now know that one of our coworkers, is getting treatment for cancer. And should I have ever seen that? Is that an appropriate use of that type of data? Now that I've stumbled across in a search for fraud or in a search for corruption, I've stumbled across something that makes me feel weird that I know that now. And is it okay? Did I violate a law? Did I just do something that I really shouldn't? So that type of example illustrates what some of the, what at least one or two of these ethical issues might be associated with the use of data analytics. But to walk through one final example that kind of illustrates the potential, for data analytics. Let's take something huge in the healthcare sector, something like the opioid crisis. Almost every time you hear about these large opioid cases, they involve large-scale mass abuse of opioid prescriptions. There's typically a pool of prescribers who are overprescribing opioids. They're typically holding some of their patients virtually at ransom for other types of treatment. And when you look back at the records, there's almost always the exact same pattern. You see it. And it would have been easy to stop in its tracks and not only prevent all the loss of money, but perhaps prevent someone from becoming addicted on the opioids in the first place. So a real, personal benefit, not just a financial benefit to catching this and stopping it early, but a societal benefit and a personal benefit to that individual. We could do it. We could start doing that tomorrow if folks had immediate access, the system had immediate access to that patient's medical records and the doctor's prescribing patterns. And you typically, between those two, you can immediately see when something like this is taking place. So why don't we do it? It would be allowable in most instances. Now, forget state laws. Sometimes state laws are stricter than federal laws. So that's a whole nother issue. But presuming it's allowable, which is, it would be allowable in most instances, why don't we do it? Okay, so these are some of the questions that sort of pop up, and I've kind of summarized them in a form of three main ethical questions associated with data analytics. The first is just sort of how we collect data, which also gets into what types of data we collect, but how we collect it, how secure is it, who is collecting it, is it a person, is it a machine, what is it, how, and then the most important question from my perspective is more how we're using the data. When I do some sort of informal surveys in front of groups, I find very, very mixed results. When I ask questions like, okay, if very personal information about you is collected, and assuming it's going to be used for a proper type of analysis, it's used to identify fraud or identify corrupt behavior or something like that. So it's a legitimate use. Would you feel more comfortable if the analysis of that data was done by a computer or by a person? And you get very, very different results when you ask that question. Because on one hand, when they're a little creeped out by the fact that a person might be looking at that data, because all of a sudden a person knows these intimate details about you. But then there's the distrust of automation and security when they're told, oh, don't worry, no person actually sees it. The computer is going to do all the analysis. It's the system that's going to do the analysis. The only time a person would get involved is if the computer flags something as being an anomaly or having all the red flags of a suspicious transaction. Then we need to turn that over to a person, for them to look at. So which would you feel more comfortable with? And you get very, very mixed results. But that's an example of one of the takes on that ethical question of how we use the data. What are we using it for? And obviously, there's the devious aspect of this too. Could data be used for completely inappropriate reasons? That's a key ethical question as well, that, organizations have to tackle that. Their initial use of data might be a very, very legitimate one, but then they have that data, and what else could that data be used for? Which gets really into the third ethical question is, once you're done with that initial and proper use of the data, what do you do with the data? How is it stored? What's it subsequently potentially used for? And how is the organization going to handle that, particularly as systems change, as people change, as strategies change, and the organization still has this, this large collection of data at its disposal. So those are some of the issues that those three is what I typically saw when we would have these kinds of discussions with organizations at the end of our investigation. Because at the end of the investigation, you typically had this type of a debriefing conversation where we say, if you want to prevent this going forward, here's what you could do. All right, we caught it, could have been caught much sooner, maybe even prevented, but it would have taken the following type of analysis. Are you comfortable doing that going forward? And the answer was very mixed. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So with that, let me turn it back over. I think I'm on my 15-minute mark. So why don't I turn it back over and we can move on, and I'll catch up with everyone afterwards.
All right, thank you very much, Gerry. So fascinating. And thank you to those of you who have started putting some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to be curating those, as you know, so appreciate that. We're going to move on to Fernando, who is going to pick right up where Gerry left off and talk about some of his experiences at Vanguard. So take it away, Fernando.
Yeah, thank you, Gerry, for introducing the topic and from your perspective, because as I was listening to what you're saying, a lot of that applies to what I've been doing over the last few years, right? It's just incredible. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself, right? As I mentioned, I've been working with Vanguard for the last 10 months. I joined this company that is firm. We provide investment opportunities, investment products, and advice for multiple investors, right? From personal investors to retirement plans, and we are the low-cost products and great yields or performance. And it's incredible to be part of a company like this, because a lot of what we do is think about, we put in front of what we do always is our customer, is think about them and how we can give them as much as possible the elements for them to make decisions about their investments, but safely safeguarding their investments and their decisions as well, right? And I'll get into Vanguard in a little bit. I'll go back a little in my life, because I think about what I've done in my life in the past. I work, like I mentioned, in banking and insurance, right? Gerry, you were mentioning about how they implanting a chip. Well, we're sort of trying to do the same thing, implanting a chip in cars, because that way we can get information on how you drive, and based on that, we can then assess and give you a better rate, right? Think of based on years, we can make more customized the way we provide your insurance. So that's kind of those opportunities that happen as we go through. But as I work in the last few years, there's opportunities where I had to do with collection of data, how you protect the data and how you use the data, right? And at all times, the role of the companies is fundamental. What are the decisions that we make of, do we ask too much? Do we ask enough information to make the right decisions, right? Do we get into that pocket area or not? We don't do that. And I give you a few examples. When I was working in consulting, I had the pleasure to work in merger acquisitions, right? And as part of merger acquisitions, you have a data room, and they have a clean room. And is the data that you're collecting, each one of them is different, and the access and the security in each one of them is different. And one example, I had to do a large transaction in 2008, and with everything that happened in the market, that transaction got postponed. So the big act after that was how quickly we could close down the clean room to make sure that all the data that was shared as part of this was safeguarded, so it wouldn't impact any of the two companies wanting to merge together, right? So that's an example of how we were collecting, then we were protecting the data from a perspective that just very specific individuals would have the access, and then when we decided that the usage was not being able to continue, it was supposed to be how you then go back and strip out the needs that you had at the moment in a way that you still safeguarding the two corporations and their customers, right? Further into my career, I continue into working, for instance, like I said, in insurance. And I was part of AIG, the insurance company, when we started with about data and data governance. And the primary premise for us was about how we secure data, how we provide transparency of data across all its legal entities, all its countries around the world. And we had to deal with GDPR when it was just its infancy, and working with the regulators on how we were doing that. We had to work with CCPA as well. I had the opportunity to work in innovation and working with at the end of the day, if you think about innovation, a lot of us wants to use the latest technologies. We want to use the Alexa devices. We want to use the Google Homes, right? And that brings another element of data ethics into that. So as we're looking to all want to run into using the latest technologies, innovations, we can give or empower our customers, right? Give them to the fingerprints of their decision-making, things that they can use, and they can make it easier from a process or get the answer they need. We also question is how we use data. An example of this would be with using an Amazon device, for instance. One thing is how much you can protect the data as part of what you're sharing, but then the conversation itself is not only proprietary of the company, it's also shared with Amazon, right? So as you're thinking about the processes, you're thinking about what are you doing in the conversations and the touch points with your customers, we'll also take into consideration what information we believe we can ask, we can collect through a voice interface, like it was an Alexa device. At the same time, what are we thinking about? What is information we're going to share in that venue as well? And if that is the case, then we decide that one channel is not the ideal from a data protection perspective or collection perspective to safeguard ourselves and safeguard our customers. It's also how we think about moving our customers in a way that is warm and hand-holding to another channel, right? So the idea of omni-channel in a way that is more suitable for our clients, but also is more safeguarding for kind and the clients and us. So if you think about from the areas of merger acquisitions, the areas of innovation, right? The areas of using data. We have collections, which has to do with, as Gerry is talking about, what information do we gather? Is it relevant? Do we need to get as much information, or can we just ask sufficient to what we need to do and offer to the clients and then move to the next level if needed? How can we allow the clients to opt in into offering such and giving that information to us, especially in a world that we're used to from an end customer perspective to just share our data, right? We have a role as corporations and firms to not push the limit on that. How we can ask, but not ask more because they might give it to us and we don't want to cross that line. Is making it proper, right? The right information, the right time. Is it proper information, or can we access third-party data that is public, available there, and use it? That we might think in the space of, and Sudha will talk more about that, if you think about AI ML, is where you're collecting data, you can leverage behaviors, or you can leverage on activities that occur in all of us on live events and incorporate that in information that we have. Well, what's the limit of how far we can go and use that information to be able to provide something better for our customers, right? Without the consent or even working with them on that. So that's from the collection perspective. At the same time, it has to do with the vehicles we use to gather and collect. So we have to be cautious about. On the protection of data, and Gerry alluded to this, is tied to the usage of data, right? And in my experience working at AIG or working at Vanguard right now, we think about those two hand in hand. And I'll step 1 second, I'll tell you about my experience at Vanguard. At Vanguard, my team is primarily 3 areas. One is business intelligence, which is the team that is working hands-on with the business every day to provide insights and information so they can run the business and grow the business. There's a group of data scientists in my organization also looking at how we can apply the latest capabilities in machine learning and AI to really think about behaviors for our clients, for our advisors, to optimize the business or to provide better solutions. Think about, as Gerry was talking about, potential identifying upstream opportunities or even identifying early on in the process fraud situations and help our clients to safeguard themselves in that aspect, right? And be more proactive about it. And the third team is the infrastructure that supports both those teams. That has to do with data management, right? It has to do with how we think about data quality, the stewardship of the data governance, and then data domain ownership. How we think about the data as we manage it in the whole ecosystem that we have, internal and external at Vanguard. Yeah? And in that context, if you think about protection of data, we're thinking about tied to the usage. So what are the profiles of those that are going to be having access to the data? Are we given a blanket access, or do we make it specific to a specific role? Right? If you're an analyst, how much data you have access to, and depends on the use case you want to use it. We might think about it as control zones. So a specific level of data could be public data, or it could be specific personal data, that for that specific domain data, it's even more a next layer of security that we put on top of that, right? It's beyond if you're specific, your role is the type of data you're talking to, you have a control zone that is beyond that. That has to do with what level of data we give you, we protect and we give you access to. Think about HR data. for certain analysis, we might want to have control at an aggregate level or very detailed level. And depending on who you are and what you're trying to do, that access is important. And then it has to do with also in protection is things such as data masking or tokenization, right? If you think from a credit card perspective, we might take information from you on this side, we tokenize it, we send it out to a vendor that they can run certain processes on that information they're getting, then send it back to us and we detokenize that, right? And if you want to add another element of complexity in that, everybody now is using cloud, right? We use Google, we use AWS. So when we think about protection of data, now we're thinking about protection of data in transit. So as we move data to one of our vendors on the cloud, could be a center technology, could be a Salesforce, could be a technology. How do they manage our information, our client information, right? In transit, it's encrypted, it's not encrypted. Are they a part to what we consider is important to us? Are they a part to what the regulators ask for us and them? Also, it's important about how they manage their end, right? Because they might have their own security levels or access levels that, depending on what capabilities they have deployed, we might have a higher threshold while we want to control data or access data, but then our vendors don't have that level. And as we always look into what are the new technologies we can use, because either are more integrated or has better capabilities that we can then bring opportunities to our clients, well, those new technologies we are spearheading with our new vendors might not have to be at the level that we want it to be from a control perspective or access perspective. Yeah? So those things are all considerations that we ask ourselves every single time that we're looking about how can we protect, how we are using the data, how we're sharing the data, how we're giving access to data. And the third piece, which is more about usage, has to do, for instance, in our own teams, using the data for the right purposes. So an analysis can be very specific, created based on a use case. And if you take that information, applying to the different case, the results might not be the best ones or might not be the ones that fit exactly for that. Another option is if you're talking about, so it's not about, the other one is about the data and how you train the models you create. In AI ML, the information that we bring in to train the models also has an ethical component, right? How much diversity can we put into that? How diverse is the model represented, right? How much can we really then turn around and apply that and use it in the right context? Yes. And the last concept I want to bring into here, and I know I've thrown a lot of things that this is how, as I'm going in through different roles and the different challenges we encounter, this is the questions we're asking ourselves, right? And this is the things we're looking to take on and consider as we look at the collection, protection, and usage of data. The last one is the concept of product ownership and how we're thinking about, from a data domain, the product ownership that has to do with not just the data that we're gathering today, but the vision of that data. How we're thinking about the data and the way we're storing it today, we're using it today, and constantly think about, is it up to date? Is the models we created, is the insights the self-provisioning reports that we're using to provide more self-provisioning and empowering our crew, our clients and employees and advisors, is it up to date? So how they're applying and using it, right, is the most optimal and is paired with the ethics that we need to be thinking about it. So constantly we're thinking about what is our role, not about what it could be, but also what it should be, right? And how we own it, not just for now, but how we think in a more holistic way. And with that, I'll just stop here. Looking forward to hear what Sudha has bring on her perspective, and then some of the questions that are coming in. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Fernando. I don't know if you noticed this, those of you who are in attendance here, but we intentionally got panelists from the world of nonprofits, from the business world, and now our final panelist, Sudha Ram, is from the world of academia. So we wanted to bring these different perspectives together, and I think the perspectives from Gerry and Fernando have been terrific from their viewpoints of the world. So now we really look forward to hearing what Sudha has to say. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Fernando and Gerry, for bringing up the most important issues with respect to collection and use of data. So as I mentioned, I direct a research center called Insight, and our goal in our research here at the University of Arizona is to be able to develop new methods that can leverage and extract value out of data, but at the same time, make sure that we're not violating privacy and we use data in an ethical manner, and how to sort of push the frontiers in terms of leveraging big data, because today we live in a world that's full of digital traces. Anytime you do anything on any digital environment, there's data that's being recorded about you. There's data that's being recorded in the Zoom interview right now, right? The Zoom webinar right now, this is being recorded. Anytime you use your GPS system in your phone, that data is being transmitted and you're using it. Anytime you post to Facebook or Twitter, anytime you wear a Fitbit or any of the other wearable devices that record your heart rate or monitor your sleep, there's digital data that's being recorded. And you're sort of, as people that like us, as we interact in the digital world, there's a lot of digital crumbs that are being recorded about us. And if we can put all these crumbs together, we can leverage people's behaviors and activities in many ways. And I think, Fernando, you mentioned this whole area of being able to record and understand people's behavior for a bunch of different applications. And Gerry, you brought that up as well in the context of being able to detect and prevent fraud, bribery, etc. Right, so today what I will talk about is how we can leverage all of these breadcrumbs in a way that can actually preserve privacy, and why we need to sort of think about this tension between preserving privacy, ethical use, and being able to extract maximum value. And in doing so, I'm going to mostly focus on cases and applications that have social implications to solve major social challenges, or to answer questions that have social implications, such as in healthcare, in education. And I will address a little bit of what's happening in today's pandemic situation as well, because you will see this tension in today's world, and which is very important for us to understand. So a couple of things about big data in general is today's data that we're able to track using these multiple sources, wearable devices, social media, electronic health records, using card scans when we enter buildings, etc. All of this data has something that's very, very important, and that is it has two things that are being tracked, which is a timestamp and a location. So every time you scan your credit card, or even you post on Twitter, or you scan a card to enter a building, let's say at the U of A or at one of your work premises, there's a timestamp that's being recorded. And that card also has a location associated with it. In some cases, it's a very precise location. It has a GPS location in it. Sometimes it's just the building ID. Sometimes it's the lat long. So there is a temporal dimension and a spatial dimension that gets attached to these digital traces, right? So if I put all of these digital traces together, I can actually track where you're going and what you're doing, right? Now, couple that with the wearable device, I know exactly, if I can put these things together, where you're spending the night, you know, how many times you turned over in your sleep, etc. So it gets to be really creepy, as Gerry pointed out, right? But creepiness aside, the question that we're going to ask is there a way to leverage this spatial and temporal dimension in a way that we can extract value and yet not sort of be so creepy about it, right? How can we use this data? How can we repurpose this data? So let me give you an example. In the area of healthcare, we're moving towards what's called precision medicine or personalized medicine, which means that when we go to our doctor and we talk to them about our health history, a lot of times we don't remember, what our habits are, whether we exercise on a regular basis. Sometimes we choose not to share with the doctor what we've been eating, how much we've been exercising. I often don't tell my doctor that I binge watched House of Cards, for example, and that I had half a pizza while sitting on my couch and being a couch potato, right? So when my doctor asks me, I'll say, yeah, I go for walks every day. I take my dog for a walk, so I'm pretty healthy, right? But the doctor doesn't know that for the last 3 weeks during the pandemic, you've pretty much been sitting on your couch or attending Zoom meetings, right? And so when people go to their doctors, the doctor records only episodic data. That is, you came in for a checkup and you had this heart rate, etc. But what we really need for the doctors to be able to kind of give you interventions or preventive care is to be able to know your habits, your behavior, your activity levels, what you've been eating, etc. Not just that day or the week before, but throughout the 6 months when you were not talking to her, right? So, there are these other sources of data that can provide a lot more insights into your health situation, and couple that with all the genetic information that's coming out. If we were able to put it all together and provide it to the doctor, perhaps they could anticipate certain problems that you might face in the future, right? And that's called personalized healthcare. So one of the problems we have looked at is chronic conditions. In the US, there are several types of chronic conditions people suffer from, but 3 of them that are very, very common are asthma or respiratory problems, diabetes, and cardiac problems, right? So we started working with a hospital that was very interested and dealt with a lot of asthma patients. And one of their biggest challenges was to see if we could provide personalized predictions about people who are about to suffer from asthma attacks or asthma exacerbations, right? Because a lot of these people show up in an ER unannounced, and the ER is not prepared to deal with such an onslaught of asthma patients. And so the problem we worked on was to see if we could leverage EHR or electronic health records, and if we could find signals from other sources like Twitter, for example, or even the environmental EPA records, data sets that regularly track environmental pollution levels, changes in temperature, humidity levels, and so on. If we could put social media data with the EPA data sets on the environmental monitoring with the EHR records to be able to predict 48 to 72 hours in advance how many people will show up in an ER with asthma-related complications. So how do you do that? How do you answer a question like that? Well, if you just take your past history of patients who show up in an ER, that's nice, but it's like tossing a coin, heads or tails, and you really can't tell how many people would show up based on that because there's simply no pattern to the number of patients having asthma problems and showing up in the ER. But now you start to look at the EPA data and you look at pollution levels, and you can go down to a great amount of detail, like looking at particulates in the atmosphere on a minute-by-minute basis. You can look at levels of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, temperature changes, because drastic temperature changes often cause asthma exacerbation. But one thing that's missing here is not everybody gets affected the same way by environmental pollutants. It depends on how much time you're spending outside and what you're actually doing outside. So a lot of times if you're running outside or if you're in an area that has high pollution, that can have an effect on your asthma exacerbation. So we collected Twitter data, publicly available Twitter streams, where people actually talk about the fact that they tried to run 5 miles that day, but they couldn't. They had to stop after the first mile. Or they'll say things like, I forgot my inhaler, or I need to go get a refill of my asthma medication. And so because of that, I started having an asthma attack, right? And so if we can grab this data, couple it with EPA data and the electronic health records, now we're able to predict with almost 80 to 85% accuracy the exact number of patients that will show up in the next 24, 48, or even 72 hours in an ER, specifically geared towards asthma complications. So how can a hospital use this? Well, if they have advance notice, they can make sure the right kinds of physicians are on call. They have the right kind of equipment, so that if patients, if we're predicting there's going to be a high incidence of asthma patients coming into the ER 48 hours from now, the nearby hospitals can be on call, on notice. And so essentially you're able to treat these patients in a much better way, right? So that's almost real time advance kind of, and that's the value of doing predictions. But when you're trying to do predictions like this, remember, you're actually sifting through people's social media posts and you're looking at what they're saying. And in the case of diabetes, it would work because you can actually mine that to see what people are eating, how much they're exercising, things like that. And when shared with physicians, they can give you much better treatment. So the question then comes up is this ethical use of data? Is this something that we should be doing? If I were a patient, I would say, yes, I want my doctor to give me the best treatment, knowing my full health history, my full activity. But I certainly don't want to share this information with my health insurance company, right? I don't want them to, crank up my insurance rates because of this, right? So what is the ethical use of data? So we have to consider the fact that it's the patient's health, but who should we be sharing this information with? Let's take a slightly different example here. Today we're dealing with the pandemic, right? And the best way to kind of make sure that the virus doesn't spread is by a mechanism called contact tracing. What is contact tracing? If someone tests positive for COVID, we want to make sure that whoever interacted with that person in the last, let's say, 10 days should be warned. And it depends on the amount of interaction they had, right? So if I test positive and I've interacted with 3 of you in the last 3 or 4 days, and I've spent, talking to you, spending more than 15 minutes, it's likely that you're exposed, right? So how do we identify people like that? One way, of course, is to embed a chip in everybody and track wherever they go. And that way you're able to see who interacts with who. But that's hugely privacy invasive. You don't want to do that. So Google and Apple have come up with this new API or application programming interface called the GAIN interface, the Google Apple Exposure Notification Bluetooth-based interface, where you can develop apps and you can put those apps on phones. Of course, you voluntarily download those apps. You turn your Bluetooth on, and the phone tracks, which other phones it's coming in contact with without revealing people's identities. And so if I test positive, I put that into the app, and the app recognizes that there were 10 other people who were around me and who spent more than 15 minutes. And it notifies those phones without revealing the identity that I am the person that tested positive, but that they came in contact with someone who tested positive. And so likely they should either quarantine or they should decide to go in for a test, right? So again, this is something we need to be able to do, but, and that's the only way we can actually make sure that people follow rules, they quarantine, etc. So I think what we want to think about is how can we leverage these very detailed, granular pieces of data with a timestamp and a location, but we do it in a way that's privacy preserving, like in the case of contact tracing or in the case of the asthma exacerbation I talked about. And so as a company or as a domain, as a service provider in healthcare, if I want to be able to leverage these kinds of data, I have to put in policies where I can collect these types of external data, store them, and tokenize them, and then link them together so I'm able to build prediction models based on which interventions can take place. So I'm going to stop here, and maybe I can answer other questions as well. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sudha. And thank you to all three of you. So we're going to go into a 15-minute period now where we would love to hear your reactions to each other. So now that you've all had a chance to do your 15-minute piece, Gerry and Fernando and Sudha, if you would just kind of chat about what each other said. We're very anxious to hear what you have to say. So take it away, whoever would like to start.
Sure, I'll go ahead and throw one out because I wanted to pick up on something that Fernando said that I thought was a very, very important point, that for listeners who are, with organizations, I think it's a key issue regarding the whole idea of who has access to what types of data, and just how important of an issue that is. And what my experience has shown is that oftentimes in larger companies anyway, the initial planning out of who has access to what data is done fairly well. There's someone is hired for a particular position, and that position has been sort of analyzed in terms of what types of information they should have access to and what information they shouldn't have access to. But as people progress, as they transfer from one department to another, or even just as they get promoted within a department. In fact, that's the most common problem I saw, is as people get increased responsibilities within an organization, it oftentimes parallels with increased access to data, when in fact, in most cases, some of the data that they used to need, they no longer need, and they should be getting cut off from data like that. So I wanted to kind of throw that back to Fernando for a second and see how is that handled, in some of the organizations that you've worked with, because I think as an investigator, I found that to often be a problem, that the very person who committed a fraud or engaged in wrongdoing had access to information that they no longer needed, that they needed 5 years ago, but they don't need it now.
Yeah, and Gerry, that's an excellent question, because we do have working very close with data management and audit. Every time that somebody changes their role, they have to go through a revision of what access to data they have. What is their profile? Has their profile changed? And even within the profile, we also look at what access that profile has, because it might be that sometimes we try to standardize as possible many things to make sure that we can make it easier to transition from one place to another one, or to standardize even roles and categories, right, across the organization. And the challenge with that is sometimes when you give a job profile, well, you might put somebody in a job profile that gives them certain access, but then if you were to double click on that, maybe for that person, they shouldn't have that access. So I think this is a combination of the data management team and audit together, right? Even separate in the organization, to work together to make sure that one is, when we have somebody changing a role to another one, the manager in place is the one rectifying this, the right roles and responsibilities they have from a data access perspective. And two, data management will continue to, from a control function perspective, check and create spot checks on what data is being accessed by who. So it's two sides of the question. One is on the person side, two is on the data side, and check that the data is being accessed for the right people and the ones that should be able to use it.
Yep, because I think organizations have an ethical responsibility to do that and to be vigilant over that. And I see many organizations being rather careless in that regard. And your organization, fortunately, sounds like it's very much on top of that, because to me that's textbook of how it should be done. Of every time there's a change in a position, a promotion, a transfer, reassess. Just reassess the whole thing. What do they really need? And that is a very commonly overlooked step.
That is true, and I'll take it to even add another layer of complexity, which is if I go to what Sudha was talking about, the pandemic, right? Well, there's another aspect of the pandemic, which is everybody's working from home. I've been working from home the last 5 months now, same as me, as everybody else. So that adds another level of complexity to the protection of data and access of data, right? And I'll give you one example. We had partnered probably in February with a vendor to come in and help us to bring in new capabilities to some data that we have. And pandemic hit, and we just realized that we needed the vendors to work in our office because they were working in a very secure environment. So now the question is, what do we do? We'll still want to move forward. So it brings us a problem-solving situation where we have to think about how we can move forward in developing this capability that is going to be critical for us, but at the same time safeguarding or considering that now the vendors that we have won't be able to do it from our location. Yes. The same thing happens with certain specific data that we would give you, for instance, to you, Gary, or to you, Paul, or Sudha, if you're in the office. But now if you're working from home from a personal network, even if you're doing VPN, because now it's information that might rely also on your laptop, we have to take a second crack at it, right, and think about it. So that would be the sort of the added complexity that we find into profiles, access in the world of the pandemic and working from home. I want to ask a question to Sudha, right? You talked about access of data from the Fitbits and things like that. And one of the big debates that sparked a few weeks ago was Google buying Fitbit.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? And saying, well, we won't be touching the data, right? So with your experience and how much you've been involved from a healthcare perspective and even the use of data and collecting data, can you talk a little bit more what your perspective is in that debate?
Yeah, so that's an excellent example you just provided, which is Google buying Fitbit data, because Google pretty much knows about everything about us right now. They know what keywords we use for searching. In fact, most of you must be aware of Google's flu trends. Google has a tool called Google Trends, which came out of their flu trends, which was the CDC had a question about how far and how fast is flu spreading? And this was a few years ago, right? And so Google said they could create a tool where they could look at keyword searches that people were doing because they know the location and they know the timestamp. So it's based on those two characteristics I was talking about. And they could use that to predict, where flu was spreading and how fast, so that the vaccine could be rushed to places where it's expected to spread, so you can give it to people there and thereby clamp down on spreading. It's sort of very similar to the pandemic situation here, except it's not a pandemic in that sense, it's flu, right? And so now, but what Google found was that while it was very useful, it tended to sort of sometimes underestimate, sometimes overestimate the locations where flu are spreading, because just because people search for keywords doesn't mean that they personally have that problem. It could be that they were searching for someone else, or they were in general concerned about flu, or they were having a headache, and so they decided to search for symptoms related to flu, right? And so Google kind of modified their algorithm. It was still very useful, and it was used for production of the flu vaccine and making sure that people were being prioritized based on where it was spreading. So I think that's a great use of data, right? In the same way, like I said, if you really want true personalized healthcare that caters to individuals, I think giving people, patients or end users, the ability to share their data with their physicians is fine. But the question becomes, do we really want to share it with a company that's going to leverage it in different ways? So understanding how that data is going to be repurposed, what it's going to be used for, and whether that use is ethical has to be a part of any sort of review when it comes to looking at repurposing and linking various kinds of data sets together. And so I would want to ask questions about, what is this Fitbit data going to be used for? Do we have consent from people? Are they actually allowing you to use it? Is it going to offer some benefits for me, right? Now, we never think twice about when we go to Amazon. Amazon says, hey, your birthday is coming up, or this person for whom you sent a present last year, their birthday is coming up. Would you like to order this for them, right? We've come to accept things like that. I think we want to be able to do that for our own healthcare now, right? So where is the Amazon of healthcare, where we can combine all of these data sets together that will then feed back into benefits into our own health? So that's kind of how I think about connecting these different data sets.
Right, I'm gonna interrupt you guys. I honestly would love to listen to you go back and forth, the three of you, for hours and hours. But I do want to keep us on track, and some of our attendees have been submitting some just absolutely amazing questions. And one of them, I think, I want to start with this question because it gets at what you guys were talking about. So, you know, Gerry and Fernando, you guys had talked about this issue of like restricting access to data when people are moving roles and things, and that's an internal policy that companies have to address, right? One of our questions from the Q&A mentions that, you know, a lot of the big tech companies have been very resistant to increasing transparency around the data they collect. How do you guys envision, you know, sort of ideal governance of data privacy? You know, what sort of regulatory restrictions do you think we should see with respect to these issues that gives consumers some level of control, yet is not so cumbersome as to prevent access to beneficial uses by nonprofits, academics, industry, et cetera? So I'm going to toss that out to whoever would like to take that up.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, and I'm sure each of the panelists has thoughts on this. But my personal opinion is that there is some increased regulation necessary here, if for no other reason, to at least improve the transparency, improve some of the required disclosures of what types of data are even being collected. It gets tricky in terms of what it's going to use for, unless it's going to be sent to third parties, which a lot of that, some of those disclosures are already in place. But in terms of internal uses, it would be hard to regulate that, I think. But I think at a minimum, some increased disclosure surrounding just the types of data that someone is even, I mean, let's face it, people who are experts in this know exactly what kind of data Google is collecting and what kind of data a Fitbit is collecting and things like that. It's everybody else that isn't in this day-to-day, that has no idea what kind of data they're giving up and what kind of data they're turning over. And I think that kind of, you know, there needs to be some better, some enhanced disclosures there of, you know, hey, when you're using this, do you realize you're giving us the following data? You know, and just so people know.
Yeah, I completely agree with Gerry. I think there should be some transparency. But I think if you start to put increasing regulations, it's going to stifle innovation. Because I think one of the best things that's happened about advent of big data is that we're able to solve old problems in a brand new way by leveraging all kinds of data. And the best way to stifle innovation, in my perspective, is to start regulating everything. And so I think there has to be some sort of a happy medium in terms of informing people. And I also think there's a big generation gap here, because we've done experiments at the University of Arizona. Some of my experimental economics colleagues have done experiments with students, where students are happy to give their data even if they get a slice of pizza or 10% off to buy a t-shirt or a jacket. So I think at least revealing to them what data they're giving out, and if they're okay with that, getting their consent. But the more sort of consent-based collection you start doing, it's going to start to put more barriers And then that's going to lead to not being able to use any of that data.
Sudha, I have a follow-up question for you while we're on you, Sudha, that is related to this issue that also came in. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but obviously in Europe with GDPR, they've taken a more aggressive stance than the United States has. Do you see the U.S. Going that direction, and how do you see GDPR affecting these issues that we've just been talking about?
So I think GDPR is very interesting. It's also completely unintelligible, honestly. If you read all of the, reams of paper or documentation on GDPR, and it has a lot of things in it in terms of what can be, what can't be done in terms of usage and collection. But the thing is, there are no consequences. And slowly we're starting to see people thinking about talking about those consequences. And you've seen all the Senate hearings, recently for Facebook and Amazon and Netflix and Google and so on. So I think the GDPR lays out a lot of things in a very interesting way, but it doesn't go completely into what should be done, what shouldn't be done. But at least one thing they've said is you can use the data for research purposes, but for anything else, you have to get permissions and so on. I'm not sure that the US will go entirely in that direction, although it's sort of moving a little bit in the direction of GDPR.
Yeah, from a corporation perspective, what I could add there, Sudha, is that two things. One is what it did, GDPR, and I was at that time with a company that we were sort of working side by side with the regulators to figure out what that meant, right? They said, hey, in 2 years, end of May, GDPR goes in effect. It's like, what does it even mean? So we were working with them side by side to figure that out. What it did is it pushes out us, the corporations, start thinking about where do we have the data? How can we make it transparent in a way, even if it's internally, that if a client says, I want to have access to my data and I want to delete it, we can provide it to them, right? So it forces us to think about changing the paradigms on how we think about data, protecting the data, and having access to a data in that perspective. Also, it made us think about what are the processes behind that, right? So that's one thing, that aspect that we were not thinking about it, and now we do. Everything we do, everything we are embarking on, that is top of mind as one of the things we should do. Secondly, GDPR was done from a European community perspective. In the US, what you see is the different states taking their own approach. So you have CCPA, you have in New York State, you have the other states proliferate in their own version of that. For better or for worse, right? But at the end of the day, when we're launching a new product, like I was doing a couple of years ago, as I was tackling into California, I had to think twice, how we're going to be launching that, what communication we're looking at, what clients, what can we do, what we couldn't do. So it's great in one sense because each state is managing their own safekeeping. On the other hand, it's a little more complicated because when you want to launch something, it has to be very customized and consider those things in every state.
Fernando, I want to stay with you and shift gears just a little bit, but as our sort of industry representative on the panel, a question came in, and I'd really like to know your thoughts on how you handle the possibility of bias in data. I mean, you're making decisions based on data that impact actual consumers. How do you account for and compensate for the potential of bias in that data?
That's a fantastic question. And it's a great debate, right? When you think about advanced analytics or data science and you're building models that are being trained on specific data, well, it depends how you gather data. How can you create a statistically significant data model that is going to give you the right information, but at the same time, is diverse enough, right? And I think that's the constant question that we manage every day, and we keep on revisiting the way we can, we keep on revisiting how we tackle that every time, right? I think I don't think there's a straight answer to say it's A or B. I think, is trying to make sure that as we're looking at it, we ourselves are auditing ourselves to make sure that the way we built the model and the way the model is applied, right, or the output of that model has been applied, is on the right setting. We can have an amazing. So one of the things we're doing at Vanguard is we have customer experience journeys, right? So we're thinking end to end in the notion of journeys from a customer perspective. But if we're creating a specific analysis for that journey, we have to be very careful that what is the purpose, to what Sudha was saying before. If we were to take that output or those insights and we try to apply it to a different context, then it might be a little bit biased, right? So I think that's where us as a role, the role of an analyst, the role of a data scientist, and then the role of the leaders is to ask those questions. Where is it coming from and how we apply it?
All right, fantastic, thank you. I want to shift over to Gerry, and a couple of questions have come in our Q&A on the same theme, so I'm going to try and combine them a little bit. But you spoke earlier about using data in investigations, and a couple of our attendees seem interested in the sort of the trade-offs between using data to benefit investigations, but also being mindful of employee privacy, and how do you weigh those, and is there a line between spying or catching employees and preventing bad behavior? Maybe if you could speak to that for a minute.
Sure. And there is a line. Sometimes it's a fairly clear line, and sometimes it's a bit of a blurry line. And part of that depends upon the actual state and location of the data and where the data is actually held. And oftentimes where the data is not necessarily where the employee is that's being investigated. So those are considerations. So it starts first with just what the law says. But increasingly we're seeing blurry lines, with data in terms of whose data is it when it's a personal device that's being used for business purposes, or it's a business device that's being used for personal purposes, and who owns that data then when all that data is on the one device. And these are some of the questions, a couple of the questions we always have to ask ourselves as investigators. So, because the last thing that you want to do as an investigator is to, find data that shows that somebody might be guilty of a crime, only to find out that we shouldn't have ever seen that data in the first place. That just, not only does the person who committed a crime walk, but now they can probably sue us too for having access, and accessing data that we shouldn't have had in the first place. So it's an incredibly important issue. And I've seen a complete mixed bag in terms of investigators' awareness of this as an issue. I've said that there's a knee-jerk reaction within some organizations when they suspect wrongdoing. They just want to tear into it and find out who's doing what, and they will access any information that they can. I can recall one investigator who was also very good at data analytics, and this person's approach to doing analytics was just give me all the data you can get your hands on and let me sort through what I need and what I don't need. And that's just a huge, huge mistake, of course. No, you don't get all the data. That there are lines that can be crossed here. It also gets back to kind of looping back to something, Sudha was saying in terms of consent and things like that. I'm not a big fan of people having to consent to everything, but to disclose to them what is being collected. And the same holds true with employees, disclosing to employees that, hey, when you use this device that was paid for by us, given to you by us, and you use it for personal purposes, we have the right to that data, actually. In many states, most states, the company technically has legal rights to some of that data. Should we use it? Again, it always gets back to the ethical question. Legally, yes. Ethically, should we? When it's clear that some of that data is personal and most of it is business and some of it is personal, should we make sure we don't look at any of the stuff that's personal? So, but yeah, it's a very, very common investigation question, and one that's getting much, much more complicated as we have all these mixed devices.
Yeah, can I just follow that up for just 1 minute, which is, when we install an app on our smartphone, oftentimes it says, you know, you've given me permission to access everything on your phone. And there's no reason why the app should have access to our photo album, to our contacts. Maybe all it needs is the GPS location or the Bluetooth, and that's it, right? And so having the app disclose exactly what it's collecting will then sort of put the burden on the app developer to make sure they're not just collecting things they don't need or they may need at a future point in time. And so that's very important to be transparent about that.
All right, thank you. I'm going to actually cut us off there. There are more questions, and I would have loved to gotten through every single question, but this is obviously a rich topic, and people are interested. So thank you to everyone who has sent in a question in the Q&A, and if we didn't get to it, I apologize. We just didn't have time for everything. But thank you again to Gerry and Fernando and Sudha, our excellent panelists. You guys have just been terrific for us. So as we move into our final few minutes here, I want to turn it over to our sponsor, Doug Zanes, for just a few closing thoughts from him, and then he's going to turn it over to Paul to wrap things up.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I just wanted to take a minute now that everybody's really kind of gone through the program and make a quick point. I mean, that really revolves around why Claudia and I, are such big supporters of the Eller Center for Leadership Ethics. And it's the idea that, Eller starts with high school kids and the high school competitions that Eller runs, or ethics competitions that they run. And the hope is, and the idea is that as these young people go through this process of thinking ethically and solving problems ethically, not only does it prepare them to really think about these large, complex problems and and solve them in positive ways within the business environment, whether it's for Fortune 500 companies or their own small businesses when they get older and move forward in their careers. But it also applies to, if you think ethically, the idea would be you don't stop working at 4 o'clock, knowing your employer's paying you till 5. That's an ethical decision. You don't choose to, take unemployment, for example. Our system has changed with COVID. When you have a job opportunity, because it's easier, even though they both pay the same. It's how do you think ethically in life? And it bleeds over into the business world. And then you get into what we've talked about today and how complex these business problems really, really become at a high level. And Eller moves on and they have these conversations and they have competitions for undergraduate, college students. And, they have these discussions at their MBA program level. And so if there's anybody who's listening to this and you're sitting there thinking, you know what, we have these problems in my company, reach out to Paul, reach out to Michael. I mean, talk to them about whether or not the center can actually come in and help your company, because quite frankly, they do, I believe, as part of what they do, they're willing to do that. And it's at a really, really high level, because this is just one topic and you see how complex it is. You think of all the topics that businesses go through in a given month, in a given year. And that's why this program exists. And I think, this is just my opinion and it's Claudia's opinion, that this is, quite frankly, Eller Center for Leadership Ethics is the best ethics program in the country. I mean, it really, really is. The amount of effort that's put into this and what the diversity of what this program does, and Paul and Michael and everybody involved with the program does, is fantastic. And so I just wanted to put that out there and give you guys that, from my perspective. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Paul. Great program.
Thank you, Doug. We very much appreciate your thoughts. We are now at the close of the program, so I want to just say something or repeat something that Gerry started out with, which was just fascinating, and it dovetails in with Doug's point. You know, Gerry, you said at the very onset, and both Sudha and Fernando also weighed in on this point. You know, today when we think about the whole data collection, protection, and usage, it's like walking a tightrope, right? When you said that you got to try to balance the legal and the ethical. And the fact that we're doing today's webinar virtually because we are in the middle of the pandemic and how each of our panelists have hit this point in their own way, now we even have to balance this really tricky question about personal privacy, right, and public health. And as with any thought leadership or webinars with just exceptional panelists that are experts, many times I feel like I am that philosopher leaving you all with more questions than perhaps answers, but that is just the nature of our environment today. So I just want to say, again, a big thank you to Mariah, our program coordinator extraordinaire. She's just been fantastic and just a wonderful job, Mariah. I want to thank Michael for his fantastic moderating duties. I thought it was really flawless. To each of our panelists, Gerry, Fernando, and Sudha, for sharing some of your expertise today. And of course, I want to thank both Doug and Claudia for their continued generous support and also willingness to get involved in everything that we're doing in the center. As Mariah has put up on our screen here, there are opportunities for all of you, and a big thank you to all of our guests to get involved with the Center for Leadership Ethics in many different ways. We have programs coming up here in the fall with our collegiate ethics case competition. It's the 18th year that we're doing this, so we're always looking for judges. In the spring, we have our high school ethics forum. If you're interested in facilitating some of our sessions with students from throughout the state. And of course, next year, when we run our Executive Ethics Symposium in 2021, we've already got, I think, our seed concept here with kind of looking at the ethical implications of moving everyone to a remote environment. The last thing I want to just ask everyone, all of our guests, is once this webinar concludes, and we are going to provide the entire experience on our website. So if any of your colleagues or friends missed today's webinar, they'll have an opportunity to go back and queue it up. At the very close here, you're going to have an opportunity to do a survey. And I have told clients my entire career, and I know that Sudha would agree as well, feedback is a gift. And that survey, we have worked really hard to make it very short, so it's very, very concise, but it also is going to give us some really important data that we are going to use to make our future programs even more effective and more on point. So again, I would like to say thank you to all of our guests from throughout the world, our dynamic panel, Mariah, Michael, and of course, Doug and Claudia. I want to wish you the very best and enjoy this weekend. Take care, everyone. Thank you.